Open your banking app. Check your grocery receipt. Look at the phone in your hand. 3 companies you've probably never given a second thought to own a meaningful piece of every single one of them. Not metaphorically, literally, as in, listed on the shareholder registry, with actual voting power at the annual meeting. Their names are BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. Together, they manage well over $30 trillion. And according to research mapping their holdings, they constitute the largest shareholder in roughly 88% of companies in the S&P 500. Read that number again. Not 88% of some niche sector. 88% of the 500 largest publicly traded companies in America. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. These 3 firms don't just own one airline, they're major shareholders in nearly every major airline simultaneously. Not one bank, nearly every major bank. American Airlines, Delta, and United Continental. JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, and Citigroup. Direct competitors, all significantly owned by the exact same 3 institutions at the exact same time. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a documented structural shift researchers have been tracking for over a decade, the quiet result of hundreds of millions of ordinary people, including you, possibly putting retirement savings into low-cost index funds. Every dollar that flows into one of those funds gets pooled and voted as a single, unified block by whichever of the big 3 manages it. The scale of the infrastructure behind this is almost as staggering as the ownership itself. BlackRock's own risk management software, called Aladdin, processes more than $21 trillion in assets, over 10% of the entire world's financial assets, running through a single company's technology platform. And in 2026, this quiet concentration of power finally collided with the legal system. In February, Vanguard agreed to pay $29.5 million and fundamentally change how it manages U.S. equity investments, the direct result of a lawsuit accusing all 3 firms of using their collective ownership to manipulate an entire industry. In this video, we're going inside the big 3, how 3 companies quietly became the largest shareholder in corporate America, what that ownership actually lets them do, and the 2026 legal reckoning that's forcing one of them to change course. Welcome to WealthVaultX. This is how 3 companies actually own your entire life. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the product that made it possible, the index fund. State Street actually launched the very first index fund back in 1973, creating the passive investing model that would eventually reshape the entire industry. Vanguard followed shortly after, pioneering what it called the first index investment trust, a fund designed simply to track the market rather than try to beat it. The genius of the model was its cost. Vanguard, uniquely among the 3, is structured so its funds actually own the company itself, meaning Vanguard operates at cost, passing savings directly to investors rather than maximizing profit for outside shareholders. That structure let it offer the lowest fees in the entire industry, and money poured in as a result. BlackRock built its dominance differently, largely through its massive iShares ETF business and its acquisition of Barclays Global Investors in 2009, instantly making it one of the largest asset managers on Earth. Today, BlackRock alone manages roughly $10 trillion, more capital than the GDP of every country on the planet except the United States and China. The growth curve is almost hard to visualize. Index funds held roughly $2 trillion in assets in 2007. By 2023, that figure had grown past $11 trillion. Vanguard alone went from holding 5% or larger stakes in a relative handful of S&P 500 companies in 2007 to holding that same significant position in essentially the entire index by 2017, a more than 30-fold increase in just 1 decade. None of this required a single hostile takeover, a merger, or an acquisition in the traditional sense. It happened purely through the mechanical, steady growth of ordinary people choosing low-cost index funds for their retirement accounts, millions of small, individually reasonable decisions aggregating into 3 companies holding an outsized ownership position across nearly the entire American economy. The big 3 didn't seize this position. They were simply standing in exactly the right place as an entire generation of investors moved toward passive investing. Here's where this stops being an abstract statistic and starts touching your actual daily life. Because the Big Three's funds simply track the entire market, they don't choose to own just one airline or one bank, or one phone manufacturer. They own significant stakes in nearly all of them, simultaneously, direct competitors, held by the exact same three institutional shareholders at the same time. This is what researchers call common ownership, and it applies far more broadly than most people realize. The bank that holds your checking account, and the 3 or 4 banks that compete with it for your business, are very likely all significantly owned by BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street at once. The airline you flew last time and the 2 or 3 you compared prices against almost certainly share the same major shareholders. The theoretical concern researchers have raised for years is straightforward. If the same 3 investors own significant stakes in every company in an industry, does that reduce the incentive for those companies to compete aggressively on price against each other? After all, aggressive price competition that hurts one competitor's profits also hurts the shared owner's overall return. Across the entire industry, it's genuinely difficult to prove this plays out as deliberate coordination, and the Big Three have consistently, forcefully denied that it does. But the sheer scale of overlapping ownership means the theoretical question is no longer confined to academic journals. It's become the basis of real, active litigation, which we'll get to shortly. For now, the simplest way to understand the scale, the Big Three, collectively cast votes at more than 40,000 shareholder meetings every single year. Every proxy vote, every decision about executive pay, every stance on corporate strategy across thousands of companies, a meaningful share of that voting power sits with 3 firms voting on behalf of hundreds of millions of individual retirement savers who, in practice, will never personally weigh in on how their shares get voted. You may own a tiny fraction of a company through your 401k. The Big Three, in aggregate, may be voting your shares on questions you never even knew were being asked. There's one piece of BlackRock's operation specifically that deserves its own explanation because it extends the company's influence well beyond its own funds. It's called Aladdin, BlackRock's proprietary risk management and portfolio analytics software. Aladdin doesn't just manage BlackRock's own money. It's licensed out to hundreds of other financial institutions, banks, insurance companies, pension funds, and other asset managers who use it to analyze risk across their own portfolios. The combined assets running through Aladdin systems, either directly managed by BlackRock or simply monitored using its software by other institutions, exceeds $21 trillion, more than 10% of all global financial assets, flowing through infrastructure built and controlled by a single private company. This matters because it means BlackRock's influence isn't limited to the companies it directly owns shares in. Its risk models, its assumptions about markets, and its analytical framework quietly shape decision-making at institutions that have nothing to do with BlackRock's own funds, a kind of infrastructure-level influence. That's genuinely difficult to fully measure from the outside, precisely because so much of it operates as licensed enterprise software, rather than headline-grabbing ownership stakes. Layer that infrastructure on top of the direct ownership picture, and a clearer image emerges. It's not just that 3 companies are large shareholders across corporate America. It's that one of those 3 companies also builds and maintains a meaningful share of the technological plumbing the broader financial system uses to assess risk in the first place. Larry Fink, BlackRock's founder and CEO, has been candid about the company's intended role in shaping corporate behavior, writing directly to S&P 500 CEOs about his expectations for how they engage with long-term shareholders like BlackRock. Vanguard's own leadership has said something similar, explicitly rejecting the idea that being a passive investor means taking a passive approach to corporate governance. None of the Big Three describe themselves as passive bystanders in the companies they own. They describe themselves as active, engaged owners, which is exactly the framing at the center of the legal battle now underway. In November 2024, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, joined eventually by 12 other Republican-led states, filed a lawsuit against all 3 firms with a specific, provocative claim. The suit alleged that BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard used their collective ownership positions through proxy voting and direct engagement to pressure coal companies into reducing production, allegedly under the banner of climate-focused investment goals. The claimed result: artificially reduced coal output and higher energy prices for American consumers. The firms fought to have the case dismissed, calling the theory far-fetched and pointing out they never held more than small minority stakes in any individual coal company. In August 2025, a federal judge disagreed, denying the motion to dismiss and allowing the case to proceed to discovery. The Department of Justice and Federal Trade Commission then took the unusual step of filing a formal statement of interest, supporting the state's legal theory, the first time federal antitrust regulators had weighed in directly on how existing law applies to this kind of common shareholding arrangement. Then, on February 26, 2026, Vanguard broke from its co-defendants and settled. The company agreed to pay $29.5 million to the suing states without admitting wrongdoing, but critically also agreed to a new standard of passivity going forward, committing not to direct or attempt to direct portfolio companies' business strategies and to avoid joining coalitions with explicitly climate-focused investment objectives. BlackRock and State Street have not settled. Both continue to call the underlying claims baseless, and litigation against them remains actively ongoing as of 2026. Whatever the eventual outcome for the remaining two firms, Vanguard's settlement already represents something significant, one of the big three legally agreeing, for the first time, to formally curtail exactly the kind of active corporate influence its own leadership had previously described as central to its role. So what does a $30 trillion ownership network actually teach us about power in 2026? 3 lessons. Lesson 1. Enormous influence doesn't require conquest. The big three didn't build this position through hostile takeovers or aggressive acquisitions. They built it through the accumulated, individually reasonable choices of millions of ordinary retirement savers choosing low fees. Proof that structural power can emerge just as effectively from patient accumulation as from deliberate strategy. Lesson 2. Ownership and control aren't the same question, but they're deeply connected. Whether or not the big threes. Common ownership across competing companies genuinely softens competition, remains legally and academically contested. But the sheer scale of overlapping ownership guarantees that question will keep resurfacing in courtrooms, in regulatory filings, and in congressional hearings for years to come. Lesson 3. Even the largest, quietest concentrations of financial power eventually face a reckoning. For over a decade, the Big Three's growth drew mostly academic attention. In 2026, it drew a $29.5 million settlement, a formal Department of Justice statement of interest, and an ongoing federal court case that isn't finished yet. The next time you check your bank balance, buy a plane ticket, or glance at your retirement account statement, there's a genuine chance the same 3 companies sit somewhere in the ownership structure of nearly everything involved in that transaction. That's not a reason to panic or to abandon low-cost index investing, which remains one of the most effective tools ordinary people have ever had access to for building wealth. It's a reason to understand exactly how much quiet structural power sits behind the safe choice most financial advice recommends without ever explaining what it actually means. If this changed how you see the companies quietly running the economy, subscribe to WealthVaultX. We go inside the vault every week. One question before you go. Does this level of concentrated ownership concern you? Or is it just smart, low-cost investing at scale? Tell us below. This was WealthVaultX.